Today is the first in the series, and we're looking at board perspectives from around the globe. If we could please click on to the next chart. Our agenda today is, first of all, to spend a little bit of time talking about board effectiveness and the role of board learning in a highly disrupted world. Then we'll move on to the core of our presentation, which is really drawing upon insights from the US, from Europe, and from the Middle East. And then finally, we will have ample time for questions from our contributors around the world. Next slide, please. I'd like to start just by setting the seat at the table in its historical context. The programme grew out of the gauntlet that was laid down by Lord Davis, that everybody in business should do something to contribute to closing the gender gap in UK boardrooms. And this sets it out quite clearly. The data actually comes from the Hampton-Alexander Review and was kindly provided to us quite recently. And you can see that's progress over the years. A seat at the table was one of the initiatives that we took, and a very important one, and very much focused on building a very strong pipeline and also developing board excellence and board effectiveness. Over the years, the focus has shifted increasingly towards that competence, excellence, board effectiveness. Since the FTSE 100 went through the sort of 30%, we've also opened up the programme, and I'm delighted that now we welcome men and women to look at board effectiveness, board excellence, and also the contribution to board diversity. Next slide, please. Part of the reason, I think, for the focus has been with the complexity that boards are facing. Many board leaders need that sort of framework to think through their understanding of leadership structures and styles. Equally, the importance of a mirror, to actually be able to look at oneself, understand one's own presence and authority and ability to influence. And finally, we see many board directors looking to develop their own roadmap, how they can add value, how they can continue to develop, how they can continue to learn. And then if we move to the next slide, please. When we initiated the programme, we conducted a substantial piece of research across leading organisations internationally as to the attributes of a successful board director. And these were the 5 attributes that we established 4 or 5 years ago and absolutely hold true today. An understanding of the complexity of shareholder and stakeholder expectations for the leadership team, a firm grasp of governance, including formal and informal power structures, presence and authority, personal impact and the ability to influence, reinforcing networks of support and reciprocity, and resilience under pressure. And before we come to the main part of our presentation today on our webinar, I'd like to reach out to the audience. And if we look at those 5 attributes of board leadership, I'd like to ask the audience to rank which really stands out as being absolutely essential in today's crisis and today's complexity. Number 1, or A, understanding the complexity of shareholder and stakeholder expectations. B, the grasp of governance. C, presence and authority. D, reinforcing networks. And E, resilience under pressure. There we go. I think we've got almost 70% have voted. And I wonder if we could just show the results, please.
44% of respondents said A, understanding the complexity of shareholder and stakeholder expectations. 11% said it was grasp of governance. 15% presence and authority. 11% reinforcing networks. And 19% resilience under extreme pressure.
Thank you. Well, my presumption was resilience would have shot straight to the top of the list in, in what we've all been through in the past 3 months. But that teaches you that not to jump to conclusions. So if we can move to the next slide, please. The next part of our webinar is the reason I think most of you are here today, is to really think about what's top of the board agenda across the globe. And we've identified some attributes that I think hold true globally. But I'd like to explore today, whether there are differences in terms of what really is driving board behaviour, what's top of the list in different jurisdictions. And we have with us an excellent panel who will be able to bring very, very distinctive perspectives from different regions, but also different sectors. I'll introduce each panelist as we come to their section. And if I may, if we could start with Christine. So Christine Coignard is an independent director of Hermé, which is a French-listed miner. It's a great heritage, and I think also has exposure perhaps to some sectors that are very hard hit by the COVID crisis. And Christine also, until recently, has been an independent board member and also committee chair with Polymetal, the FTSE 100 miner. And so Christine will be able to share with us, I think, calling from Germany, being French, the European perspective, but also importantly through the sectors that, from her board experience, with a global footprint, a real insight into, a particular sector, which I think has some particular sort of insights into the disruption that's been caused by COVID. So Christine, what do you see as having been top of the board agenda over the past 3 months during the COVID crisis?
Well, thank you very much, Gillian. So for companies who are registered or listed in Europe, and based on empirical experience, a lot of discussions I've had with other directors as well, a lot of the research and reporting that has been done by the board ecosystems consultants. I think the absolute priority has remained to support and challenge management in these very unusual times. And it's been done much more intensively. Boards have been much more active, but also in different ways, which is why I mentioned my answer was the number 2, because in the direct experiences I have, it's been more important to understand, to speak with other people and to the direct, the informal influence, but also the formal influence within the board and committees have been equally important, much more the personal, individual, one-on-one influence. In terms of areas of focus, it's clearly been health and safety, and that has been across the board. It's come up extremely early in the crisis, I would say already in February, definitely beginning of March. And there the challenge has been for a lot of these companies, and definitely the ones I work with, has been the width, the scope of the health and safety coverage, both geographically, but also in terms of where do we stop? Do we stay within the company or do we go into the communities? And so what has happened in the end is many of the companies have developed safety protocols, which they have so at the corporate level, and have applied this, have delegated the application of these protocols at the local level. Eramet, we're in more than 20 countries. It has been actually quite successfully implemented. And also because a lot of the natural resources company operate in far remote regions or are primary employment suppliers, even in Europe itself, the scope of the health crisis has been expanded beyond companies and into the communities. And so there has been a lot of support provided, again, very differently depending on what the needs were. In terms of providing equipment, Russia has been the main the immediate reply to the health crisis. There will probably be more. but also in France, companies headquartered in France have all established solidarity funds, partially funded by fees from directors and from and remuneration from management. And so that has been and remains the top priority. Now that we're going towards the end of a lockdown, the question is what stays, what goes, and what stays is masks, and what stays is physical distancing. A lot of home office will stay, and you know, there's a lot of cautious. Now, the second area of priority has been crisis management, one level or another. As you mentioned earlier, you know, the two boards that have been involved, one is in the gold sector. The gold is doing extremely well. So companies in the gold sector haven't had to go into a significant crisis mode. There's, of course, lots of attention being applied to what's going on. Other sectors, Eramet, for example, has a significant amount of its sales to the aerospace sector, and that is a completely different ballgame, because that's, you know, this is an existential, those are existential issues at stake. So in the end, boards have, you know, set up their own ways to deal with this crisis. I must say that from what I have seen, most of us have been caught off guard because pandemic was not on the risk register, and there was no plan for preparation. And that actually brings a question of governance and of risk assessment and ways of assessing risk, ways of evaluating risk, and also ways of handling risk once they have materialized. There's a lot to learn from this.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. And I've jotted down, I have a number of follow-up questions there, and I can see that we also have questions already coming in from the audience. But I'll save those up, and I'd now like to move to our second speaker, Rachel Brandenburger. And Rachel is providing us with a perspective from the US, but as soon as Rachel speaks, I think you'll realize that actually Rachel is not American, and really her career as a very eminent lawyer was largely in London and Brussels until 10 years ago. She moved out to the US to become a special advisor international in the antitrust division of the Obama Department of Justice under the Obama administration. So is able and is now currently advising boards internationally, and really well placed to share with us what's top of the board agenda in the US. Rachel, if I may.
Gillian, thank you so much for your very kind introduction. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this webinar. Yes, I've been in the US 10 years now. How time flies. So maybe that qualifies me to try to share some perspectives from the US. There are many issues that are top of mind of US boards at the moment. And we'll see the extent to the similarities and differences with other parts of the world. I'm going to focus on, inevitably, COVID-19, diversity and inclusion, and also very briefly on the impact of the US's relations with the rest of the world. So first, COVID-19. Here in the US, to borrow the phrase of one of the medical experts here, we are still knee-deep in the first wave of the pandemic. As you probably know, the numbers are continuing to rise every day here. The US population accounts for only 4% of the total world population, but the US has seen 25% of the world's deaths from COVID-19. Some of the states, individual states, have begun to reopen for business. Some are having to reverse course as the pandemic continues to affect all of us. And as elsewhere in the world, this is not only a health crisis, but a very severe economic crisis as well. I've already touched on one of the aspects that companies and boards here need to keep in mind, which is we are really seeing how this is a country of 50 states. And a lot of the governance and leadership in this crisis is occurring at state and even city level. From a company's point of view, unless it happens to be located in only one state, that means it's having to face a patchwork of often conflicting regulations as to how to operate in this crisis, and of course developing and changing regulations as we work through the crisis and as knowledge increases. We are also working from a health point of view against a background where preventative measures such as mask wearing and social distancing have become politicized. So I noticed the comment that masks and social distancing would of course continue in France. One would not be able to make that comment in the same way here in the US. So against this background, companies and boards are having to be, in my notes say, resilient and adaptable. So I'm meshing with your questionnaire, Gillian, and I did vote resilient, but I would add adaptable as well as resilient. Perhaps we can come on to discuss that. And they're needing to plan not only for the immediate crisis, but also for the medium term and also for the longer term. And this isn't a one-size-fits-all solution for companies. Although it's interesting that companies are paying attention to what their peers are doing in a way that they don't necessarily do in the ordinary, old, whatever the right word, world is. And indeed, in some sectors, particularly the medical sector, companies that are usually fierce competitors are actually coming together to collaborate, to learn, to research, to find solutions that are needed. This all actually has to be done, if I can just put my lawyer hat on for a second, with temporary permission from the antitrust agencies for collaboration that in the usual situation would actually be unlawful, and that permission is forthcoming. So we're seeing sectors that are gainers from the crisis: the digital sector, the e-commerce sector, pharmaceuticals, logistical sectors, for example. Satya Nadella, the Microsoft CEO, believes that the pandemic has, and I quote him, driven 2 years of digital adoption in 2 months. So we have lots of gainers from the crisis, particularly in the digital sector. We have other sectors such as transport, leisure, entertainment, hospitality, bricks and mortar, retailing, that have been very hard hit, are still very hard hit by this crisis. And whether and how they're going to come back, as the phrase is becoming, is a very important consideration for the boards of those sectors. Let me quote another tech CEO, Arvind Krishna of IBM, who said something that I think resonates. He said, businesses and communities around the world are in various stages of reopening. As they do, changing how they work isn't a consideration for tomorrow, it's an imperative for today. And he added, this isn't a restart, it's a rethink. I think that sentiment perhaps applies beyond the tech sector. So The second issue of diversity and inclusion. Boards of US companies are increasingly under scrutiny for their leadership in this area. COVID-19 has revealed, or at least heightened, awareness of the widespread health and socioeconomic issues in the US. The statistics to show how hard hit, statistics issued by the CDC, for example, how hard hit the communities of color have been by this pandemic in comparison with the white section of the population are horrifying. The statistics are about 5 times higher for communities of color. The issues that underlie this, living conditions, health conditions, underlying health conditions, work circumstances, unemployment issues, usually no sick pay in this country, uninsurance in terms of medical cover. They're well known, but we're seeing them in reality every day. And on top of that, the recent deaths of George Floyd and other African Americans have really put a spotlight on systemic racism in this country. And there are calls for action for all in leadership positions, and that includes boards of major companies. So CEOs are issuing statements and companies are making financial donations, but I think responsible boards really need to examine their company's diversity and inclusion, not only the policies, but what's happening in practice, and not only what is overt, but also what is sometimes much more subtle. So the calls for action and the scrutiny under which the boards are operating are real. Darren Walker, the head of the Ford Foundation, calls this the Great Awakening of USA Inc. And he is optimistic about the outcomes. I would say it really is the responsibility of boards to help ensure that there is a positive outcome from this issue, which is related but also separate from COVID-19. Last and very briefly, although it's a huge topic, I think I would be incomplete without talking about the USA's relations with the rest of the world, its position globally in the world, highly relevant to all US companies that are multinationals. And we've seen in the past few years already tendencies towards economic protectionism, onshoring, reshoring of supply chains, greater scrutiny of foreign investments, imposition of immigration controls, and the US's withdrawal from some of the multilateral organizations that it's played a leading role in since the end of World War II. The current pandemic is reinforcing all these tendencies in the US and elsewhere. Relationships with the US and China are frayed, might be the correct word. Relations between the US and Europe are not as smooth as they have been in the past. And so US companies that do business or have operations around the world are needing to reassess the risks that these trends are presenting them with and needing to decide whether they need to put alternative strategies in place. So to sum up, I think boards here in the US are needing to consider and reassess the near, medium, and longer term. And I would say as never before, because yes, this country and other countries have been through crises before, but perhaps not on the same global scale as we're seeing here. So to go back to where I started, resilience and adaptability, I think are perhaps the lodestars here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Plenty of food for thought, and I think also that sort of geopolitical setting, which is very relevant for any board director, and particularly for board directors sitting on representing companies, leading companies that span those jurisdictions, and that's might be a theme that we can come back to. And maybe I could just reach out to the audience. We are getting some questions in. If you'd like to ask your question anonymously, that's fine. We are recording, and I will read out the names, but please don't let that deter you from asking questions. There's a lot of material, a lot of food for thought here. And now I'd like to come to Alistair, that geopolitical link. If we move to a completely different part of the world, Alistair has recently returned from the Middle East. He was head of the Dubai office of the Credo Business Consulting, and now I'm delighted to say as a partner with Fidelio, working on strategy with our clients. Alistair, if we turn to the Middle East, what's top of the board agenda for companies in the Middle East?
I think it's fair to say, and first I should clarify that my experience is really referring to the GCC, so we're talking about the Gulf region rather than the broader Middle East. But I think a lot of what Christine and Rachel have said resonates with in the Middle East as well, in that the major preoccupation of boards in that region over the last 6 months has been survival through the pandemic. And also, I think Christine mentioned the fact that companies in Europe have become more involved probably with the health and safety of their communities as well as just the actual companies themselves. And we did see a lot of that, a lot of participation by companies in supporting their local communities in terms of health. I think that one of the things that has come out in the Middle Eastern region is that supply chains there are very dependent on imports and exports, and I think the pandemic has exposed the fragility of many business models, and so a lot of companies are kind of re-evaluating how they actually run their business. And a further element which has been particularly damaging in the region is the fact that there was a double whammy of the pandemic plus the collapsing oil price, and so much of the economics of the region is driven by oil that it's been hit particularly hard because of the collapsing oil price as well as the pandemic. On the other side, the labour market structure there, particularly in a country like the UAE, where the vast majority of private sector jobs are done by expatriate workers, it has allowed companies to shed costs rapidly as economic activity declined, and it will probably help them as they build up on the other side. So the structure of the labour market has helped companies, and typically they've reacted quite quickly. I think it's fair to say that governments in the Middle East reacted very well and very fast to the pandemic, and were very clear about the health requirements and the lockdown requirements, and companies acted very quickly to respond to that. I think looking forward, boards are facing significant uncertainty regarding the speed and extent of recovery following the pandemic. I was living in Dubai, and it's particularly true in Dubai, where a very large part of their GDP comes from air transport and tourism. And these are the two sectors that are likely to be some of the slowest to recover to pre-pandemic levels. So boards now are facing a lot of uncertainty going forward, even though the immediate actions required for the pandemic are probably over to a great extent. What I wanted to do, because this is a region that is possibly less familiar to many people, as well as thinking about what's happening in the current crisis, I wanted to think or to touch on some longer term issues that are facing boards in the region. And those three things I want to talk about is something about governance and how that impacts family companies, which are very, very prevalent in the Middle East. Gender diversity, which is an issue that we're very familiar with at Fidelio, and also ESG, again, another issue with which we have a great deal of experience in the firm. So in terms of governance, corporate governance has been an issue in the Middle Eastern region for a long time. But there has been considerable improvement over the last few years, and I've certainly seen that. I've been there 7 years, been working in the region for about 15 years, and over that time there's been an extraordinary improvement in the governance for particularly quoted companies. The latest revision of corporate codes in Saudi and the UAE now have stipulations for a majority of directors should be non-executives. There should be minimum of 33% independent directors. The separation of chair and CEO roles is now enshrined in corporate governance over there. The other thing which has started to come in now is regular board evaluations. They're compulsory in some countries, in Bahrain, Kuwait, and I think Oman, and now are recommended by the Saudi Arabian authorities, not yet in the UAE. And I think that's an area where governments, the improvement of governance will be really cemented by introducing that going forward. One of the challenges is that most of the businesses in the region are family owned and have no quoted shares. Therefore, this change in financial market regulations are not really impacting them so much. And so these firms tend to lag behind the quoted sector. So in a recent survey found that only about half of these family companies even have formal boards of directors, and fewer than a quarter have non-family members on the board. And so in a situation where many of the largest companies in the region are of this family structure, there is a significant potential for impact of any governance failings. There have been a lot of discussion about extending board governance regulation to family groups, but politically that's still extremely difficult. And where we've really seen progress made in that area, it's where boards have been wanting to attract foreign investment or partnership with foreign companies, and as part of that deal, they've insisted on an improvement in the governance rules. So that's really where we are in governance. I think it's getting a lot better, but it still lags behind, say, Europe in that area. Gender diversity is another area that we lag way behind. I saw our chart, which I've seen many times before. We're way behind even the first of those bars, in that the percentage of women on quoted company boards averages 2.5% across the GCC, with a low of 0.9% in Saudi Arabia and a high of just 3.7% in the UAE. And that's for quoted companies. If we included family companies, the numbers would surely be even lower. But in this area, the example is really being set by governments, and particularly in the UAE. Although increasingly we're seeing the same thing beginning to happen in Saudi Arabia from this very low base. But in the UAE, for example, 9 of the 32 cabinet members are women, which is pretty much the same percentage as we have in the UK. And on the Federal National Council, which is the nearest the UAE has to a parliament, 50% of the Federal Council members are women. So there's a 50-50 balance on that. So the government is leading the way to that. But there is a real challenge of getting women on boards. The Dubai financial market mandates 20% board appointments to be women. But while women hold senior executive positions in UAE-based firms and in government, the step to board membership has proven very elusive. And I think this is probably a situation, certainly Gillian will be very familiar with this from 10 years ago in the UK. And they also have the same comply or explain approach certainly in the UAE, which is allowing companies to claim that there are no suitable female candidates for these roles. There is things happening though. There's an initiative by a charity called Aurora 50, known as 20 for 2020, and this is aiming to address this issue directly and to place 20 well-qualified women into UAE company boards by the end of the year. And Fidelio is proud to be a partner in this initiative. I'm very excited by this, coming from the region. And we're specifically adapting the seat at the table program for the UAE to help candidates develop those necessary board skills. So I'll be looking with great interest at how well that moves forward, as we start to get the women onto boards and they start to actually operate in those positions. The final thing, very briefly, is ESG, which is the sort of center of the work that I do now at Fidelio. Most companies in the GCC are really only at the starting gate in terms of ESG. There's little or none of it in board reporting, in KPIs, or in any stakeholder engagement, let alone any influence in terms of the strategy development by boards in the region. And where companies have corporate social responsibility policies, they're almost always focused on philanthropy and charitable giving rather than any integration of long-term sustainable value. The Dubai financial market is trying to make a change with this, having launched its sustainability strategic plan for 2025, with the aim of making Dubai the leading sustainable financial market in the region. It includes all the right things in terms of reporting and disclosure and insistence on gender balance, but at the moment it's advisory. The regulation hasn't yet caught up with that. And I think much as we see in the rest of the world, it's going to be investor requirements reflected in market reporting requirements that are going to drive ESG adoption in the region, with the quoted companies being the first to adopt international standards. The government is being very good in terms of environmental standards, so those will be imposed by governments. But beyond regulatory compliance, I wouldn't expect to see ESG being a major issue on particularly the family group boards for a while. So just in summary then, from the Middle East, COVID response has dominated board thinking in the past 6 months, and will do so as it will continue to do so as the economy recovers, with Dubai in particular, particularly difficult situation because of the high degree of transport and tourism within the mix of businesses there. Governance is improving in the region, particularly for quoted companies, but remains a challenge in the larger family company sector, which remains outside market regulation to a great extent. Board gender diversity well behind where we are, although interestingly, picking up on one of Rachel's points, if you look at the racial diversity on boards and even the age diversity, it would shame many European and American companies, really quite diverse in that way, but not in the gender way. And that recent initiatives, hopefully Aurora 50 in the UAE, will start the ball rolling towards a more equal board membership. And then finally, I think it's a while before a true ESG mentality is going to emerge. It will emerge, I'm sure, with companies initially being driven by regulatory compliance rather than taking a lead towards long-term sustainable strategy. So my summary.
Thank you, Alistair. Thank you. And maybe I think just on that last point, I mean, what we've seen internationally is actually one of the big drivers to ESG is access to capital and international markets. And I wonder how that's going to play out. I suspect it will be quite a big driver. I'm delighted we're receiving a lot of questions from the audience. So please do keep flagging those questions. On that, and I'm going to kick off with a question from Graham Hughes, which is linked to that sort of the role of shareholders. You all talked about survival, you know, the need to ensure that the show stays firmly on the road, and then recovery. And the board clearly has an important role in that sort of longer term recovery. How in the different regions are we seeing shareholders and the business owners respond to the uncertainty? And maybe Christine, if I could kick off with you, that sort of experience of sitting on quoted boards, your observations of sort of shareholder behaviour. Have you seen particular pressures, particular understanding, and any thoughts on how investors are beginning to think through how to handle this uncertainty?
Well, the two boards I've been on, the first one was the Polymetal. I mean, the full trust in management, doing an outstanding job. And, you know, there was the usual question during the roadshows. I have to admit, I haven't been there in a time of crisis, but considering how well the company is doing, I don't think shareholders are getting significantly more involved now as they were before. As to Eramet, it's a totally different case because we have three completely different types of shareholders. We have our largest shareholders is an old industrial family, French family. Then we have the French Sovereign Wealth Fund. So we have the political authorities involved with a completely different agenda, obviously. And then we have but 1/3 of our shareholders, which are based in London and are institutional investors. So as an independent non-executive, it's a much of a challenge to understand the different preference from the shareholders while keeping our work focused on the interest of the company. So your question is right on, especially in a situation like ours where entering into the crisis with a stretched balance sheet, we do have to take significant portfolio decisions. So it's currently playing out, and it's rather complex, and of course, for confidentiality reasons, and also we're in discussion. I cannot go beyond that, but I think it just to sum up what my immediate answer to this question is, it really depends on the shareholder structure and on the state of the company, and on how far apart the various shareholders' agendas might be. You can rest assured that the agenda of the French state is rather different than the agenda of institutional shareholders. Although, of course, what we're trying to do is go in the middle and see what is in the interest of the company that can be acceptable for all our shareholders.
Thank you. Rachel, I'm going to turn to you in the US. In Europe, we've certainly seen institutional shareholders play quite an energetic role with regard to sort of ESG, diversity, climate change competence, all these issues. In the US, less so. I'd be really interested in any observations you have of how the crisis has shaped capital markets behavior and investor behavior in the US, and how boards are responding to that.
Well, I would say two things, Gillian. From a traditional perspective of investors in companies, I mean, the focus is very much on the funding and the viability of companies that are facing the crisis. Remember, we in the US, we don't operate against a background of government funding and state aid in the way that is available in Europe. So companies, there has been some government investment in a few companies, in some very important logistics companies, for example. They're responsible for bringing food across the states. But on the whole, companies that are suffering are going to the wall. And that also, there's a flip side to that, which investors are also wanting to make sure that boards and companies are paying attention to, which is for companies that have been sitting on cash, there are opportunities for strategic add-ons to companies. So the M&A world may not be the huge mega deals and headlines that the last few years have seen, but it's quite active in certain sectors. The tech sector being one, but not only the tech sector, where there are opportunities to take on board companies. The real issue at the moment is valuation of companies in this very uncertain world that we're living in. Nobody wants to actually ever to have overpaid for a company, but certainly not in the current crisis. But I would also emphasize again, so that's there's a lot going on there in the traditional role in a different environment, but I wouldn't underestimate, for want of a better term, the socioeconomic issues, the diversity inclusion issues, the Black empowerment issues, which boards are really needing to be accountable for in a way that they have not been before.
It's a hugely important topic, and thank you, and one that I do want to come back to. I just want to come back to Alistair on the ownership issue. We've also received another question which really asks about whether the sort of the family influence is this a barrier to change in terms of, for example, diversity. or are we seeing this as families seek perhaps to access other markets, thinking about this differently? Alistair, if you could perhaps link those two questions, the sort of the influence of family ownership on businesses.
Yes, I was actually going to make some points that almost the flip side of what I've been talking about in terms of governance, in terms of the response to the pandemic. I think the kind of fairly close family ownership of a lot of the biggest companies, certainly in the UAE, where I experienced this sort of most firsthand, was very positive in terms of the way companies reacted to the crisis, and particularly in the way they supported the communities around them. So I think that because the owners are very, very close to the actual communities that their companies are in, that worked extremely well. And so we did see an awful lot of work being done by companies to help the communities get through the crisis and provide them with sort of safety equipment and that kind of thing. So that worked extremely well. On the other hand, I think the treatment of employees, most of whom are expatriates, I think it was a very different matter. I think we would have considered it somewhat harsh, the way that that was treated. On your second point about, is our family company, does that hurt diversity? I suspect, if I'm absolutely honest, it probably does, simply because the traditions in the region, traditional kind of family relations in the region, are very much male oriented, and so it's a family firm with a more sort of traditional base is likely to be more difficult to persuade. And I think, as I mentioned before, I think what we're going to see two things driving those changes. Firstly, the example led by the government, and again, the government the government is the ruler and the ruler's family, and the example that the government is setting is going to be noticed by other family firms, and they are making a very strong push to say, we want sort of gender equality within our organizations. That's going to be a huge influence. And the second thing will be the impact of foreign investors and foreign investors' requirements, effectively the ESG impacts, if they want to partner with international companies, if they want to gain access to international funding and capital. That will be another pressure to move the dial on diversity.
Thank you, Alistair. We're covering a huge amount of territory here, and thank you to all of you for being able to kind of span that. And as we sort of begin to approach the end of the webinar, what I'd like to do is to sort of group some of the questions that are coming in around lessons learned. And a couple of areas that have been highlighted are one, and this is a question from Richard Shearer, what about sort of the risk planning? What about the understanding of risk, the risk matrix? I mean, Christine mentioned that for many companies, the pandemic wasn't on the risk matrix or the risk schedule. And if it was, they clearly weren't adequately prepared for it, although most have responded with admirable agility. So that's one area perhaps of lessons learned. And another is composition. We've touched upon diversity from many angles, and particularly Rachel has stressed from the US perspective. But what does diversity mean? What are the attributes that boards will need as we move forwards towards this new reality? So I leave you to answer the question as you see best, but lessons learned. And if I can start with Christine, please.
Well, the lesson learned is improve risk assessment and risk mitigation approaches, I think. The approach we have today on many boards is more or less a business as usual scenario, plus or minus, depending on markets and condition. I don't think any of the boards is really equipped for the kind of situations we were having. In the sense that, and I have seen it and I've discussed it with other, by education, I'm a banker, so I'm totally clinical about risks, but it is really unpleasant to discuss about all these risks out there. And the low probability, high impact risks are really properly addressed in boards. And also risks where you have a combination of external and internal factors happening together, turning into a disaster, is also, those scenario planning are rarely done. And what is even less done is, when that happens, then what do we do? So I think going much more, preparing boards and going into these kind of extreme situations is important, because they do happen. And I think the risk assessment today has become very much of a buck sticking exercise. It's so prescriptive now when you're a listed company to go into certain types of risk and how and what and the way you report that. It has almost, I feel, been delegated to technicians, as opposed, and also is being looked at in silos from bottom up. Of course, people in the operations know what their risks are, but how do they consolidate this? I think here there is a significant gap missing. What's also missing is testing. Pandemic was this is the part of diversity you mentioned. 10 years ago, there was a pandemic in the top 10 risks, and then it dropped out. Why? There's a herd thinking that is extremely unhealthy, in the fact that I know nobody on any boards coming from the health sector is quite not representative, but I don't think there are that many of them. And so increased diversity on boards, increased science-based approach, and that in any case it's absolutely necessary for climate change exercise and solutions, and really go into risk assessment and what do we do if this risk happen, even if we all think where they will never happen. And this is really something that needs to be done now, because we are all extremely fragile. The system has been hit, and the aftermath is likely to bring new crises. And so this is really the time to bring up our game in terms of risk assessment and preparation for action, and also to be ready when act, to be extremely flexible, to have a structural part to it, but also to put the human and the trust in the first place.
Thank you. You've packed a lot into that answer, each of which deserves more time. But I think we can all be certain that sort of pandemics will be on the risk register for the next 10 years. But it's what's not on the risk register that we're talking about. Thank you, Christine. Rachel, from your perspective, what would you add from the US in terms of lessons learned or being learned from this pandemic with regard to the board?
Well, I would agree with everything that Christine has just said. I think specifically from a US point of view, there is a huge, for want of a better term, trust deficit. Who is responsible for the situation that we find ourselves in? And also in this country, who is responsible for helping us to get out of this situation? So risk planning, governments are saying they didn't see this coming. Health experts are saying, I'm generalizing, some health experts are saying they didn't see this coming. Companies certainly didn't see this coming. And nor is this probably a one-off in terms of either health-related crises or, as Christine said, environmental-driven crises as well. So I'm thinking from my lawyer's point of view, you do a risk assessment with a board on an IPO, for example, for a company. You then have your list of risks, and you tend to do a tick box, is to use a US phrase, exercise during the annual and half-yearly results. I would hope that we will have not only a large investigation at some stage as to how this all happened and how the crisis, the impact of the crisis here, but also in terms of a much more regular checking through with real experts, both for companies and in government, for what the risks are that we face. I mean, I think we have many lessons to learn from this, but at the moment, the US is very much still in the crisis.
Yeah.
And we haven't really moved, sadly, I would say, to the next stage. We're not able to yet.
I think that's a fair point, and I think that's probably generally still very early days. Alistair, is there anything you'd like to add from the Middle East in terms of lessons learned?
I think, yes, very, very briefly, and I think this applies beyond the Middle East, but there are a number of companies where I've seen this happening there, and that is, again, in the risk thing, it's this efficiency versus resilience trade-off. I think I mentioned earlier on that the crisis exposed a lot of business model fragility in many companies. And I think what we're seeing there is people rethinking some of the efficiency that they've tried to build into these very sort of slim, long supply chains, and replace it with a lot more resilience. I think we're going to see companies rethinking their strategy along those lines. I think another thing which has come to mind, it's a slightly different thing, is the involvement of the board in making decisions. What we did see is most boards went into a sort of war footing, which meant that the executives had much more access to some of the experience of board members to make decisions on a day-to-day basis, because they were all in crisis mode. And I think from that, one of the things that may come out of that is the experience that the executive can actually make more value of the board in making decisions than they do typically, and bring them in, get them involved in making decisions on a more regular basis. And I hope that is something that will come out of the crisis. The way the executive and the board interrelate will become a little bit more constructive.
Thank you. Again, plenty of food for thought, and how we're actually deriving the maximum, how companies are deriving the maximum value and benefit from the board, and the experience that sits on the board, I think is a really good point. Before we close today's webinar, I'd like to come back to the audience and a little question in terms of another poll. So, based on your own experience, based on everything you've heard today, do we think that, given the uphill challenge that we see before us in terms of the sort of the COVID crisis, the economic crisis, and the clear need in many industries for radical transformation, do we see today's boards as A, holding companies back from the steps that need to be taken, B, providing governance and compliance but not contributing significantly to securing future growth, C, contributing much more effectively than 10 years ago in the financial crisis, or D, holding the key for companies committed to build back better, i.e. boards are the solution? And I think we can close the vote now. We're pretty much there. And so a resounding vote of confidence, I think, for the role of the board, that the board holds the key for companies that are committed to building back better. 9% did feel that boards were holding companies back, and 30%, and this is perhaps more serious, felt the boards were quite good at providing governance and compliance, but not contributing to growth. So on the one hand, I think 43% feel that boards hold the key, but equally 40% are not convinced that boards are really adding value. Plenty of material, I think, for future reference there. So thank you very, very much for that. And what I'd now like to do is move back to just the wrap-up slides, please. So Ben, yes, we could turn to the conclusion. I think it's fair to say that, we are seeing boards facing extraordinary challenge, but also making a contribution to that building back better. And I think some of the sort of the contribution from Rachel in the US, talking about the sort of the Black Lives Matter movement and the immediate impact that that's been having on composition has really sort of prompted thought. Equally, we've seen at a national and sectoral level quite different responses. Industries are impacted differently, but I think that the sort of that thread of the face mask has been quite indicative here. And I know Gillian Tett also wrote about this over the last couple of days, how it had a different symbolism in London and New York. And this is clearly something that boards will need to be culturally sensitive to. But I think going back to that poll, you know, boards will need a high degree of effectiveness. They do hold the key to building back better. And this is something that we look forward to continue to explore in this series and through the Seat at the Table programme. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our panelists today for being so ambitious and playing with us in you know, covering a huge range of territory, answering a lot of questions, and really spending the time to think through what is top of the board agenda, but also to look forward and help us think through what are the lessons that we can be learning. So thank you very much, and Alistair as well. Alistair, Rachel, and Christine, thank you all very much for your time and contribution. We've included in the material details of the next Seat at the Table programme, which will be held in September and March, and we will be absolutely addressing these issues on the role that the board is playing in building back better. And I would like to really thank everybody for joining. Excellent questions. We will keep you posted of what we're working on, and we'll share the charts and the material with you. We have recorded this webinar today, and we appreciate your contributions. So thank you very much to everybody. And I will say stay safe. It remains very, very important. And please do help us to continue to build that better. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Goodbye.